batteries.
Right. All right.
What was that?
I don't know. So are you going to press the button, Josh?
I think I pushed it.
Oh, so
Yes, real life.
can somebody in the chat just confirm that they can see us? Anyone in the chat just say they can see us? Oh, good. All right. Fabulous. Should I start,
Please.
Ida, Josh? Okay, so welcome everyone to the inaugural session of the Learning Salon. I'm going to try very briefly in a faltering way to explain what we're trying to accomplish here. And when I say we, I mean me, Josh, Ida, Knaka, and Brad. It'll be 5 of us, and Conrad is our inaugural guest. I can't quite remember exactly how we went from 0 to 60 in less than 10 seconds to get this off the ground, but it was, I think, precipitated by some kind of Twitter stream that I was late to the party about. But in the background, you know, Josh and I are both at Hopkins. Ida and I have been debating on, we met actually on Conrad's Neuro match inaugurally. And what we realized is that there is a space for debate that we described as the vertices of a triangle, which is basically systems neuroscience at one vertex, psychology, cognitive neuroscience at the other, and the ambitions of AI at the other vertex. And hovering above these 3 vertices is philosophy of mind, which informs, I think, all of them. We feel like there's a sort of urgent need to have a dialogue between those 3 vertices and the philosophers of mind. It's, in my view, more necessary probably in this field than any other. I mean, I'm not aware of philosophers of the liver or the kidney, or lots of debate about 2 ways to think about those organs. But the interesting thing about this space is that there are people who work on mind, people who work on brain, and some people who believe that one will entirely subsume the other. And so we feel like we need to all get other people's perspectives and listen and maybe see what we can do together. And the projects, as we saw them, were mainly twofold. One is, can we come up with some sense of what it will mean to understand how the brain works? And I sort of feel that what people really mean when they ask that question is, how does one get mind out of matter? How does one get that suite of cognitive abilities that humans have that we call thinking? Some people call it, general intelligence. Decide what you want to call it, but those features that are accentuated in humans, that are studied by psychologists and are responsible for all of culture and art, can we actually get these understood through brain work? And then the second related issue is, can we get cognition and mind and thinking out of another kind of matter altogether? In other words, can we do it without the need for biological tissue? So those are the 2 big themes. What does it mean to understand how the brain works? Does it really mean, do we want mind from matter? And 2, could we reproduce, simulate, mimic it in a non-biological tissue? And then obviously we believe that there's a bidirectional flow of information between those 2 questions. The more we try and mimic and simulate with AI approaches, the more we might more likely to understand how the brain works, and vice versa. So that's really what this is all about. I'll switch now to the style we want to do this in. We want this to be a salon. It was Josh's great name for this, which means that it's meant to be fun. It has to have a slightly sort of informal party-like atmosphere. Everyone should feel comfortable feeling uncomfortable. Everyone should feel that there are things they don't understand and should be able to ask immediately, that they don't know what that, acronym means, what do those words mean, and not feel like they're going to get eye rolls in response. So we want to healthy debate without anyone feeling intimidated or the least clever person in the room. We don't want any of that. The other thing I'd like to say is I think a lot has happened in science in the last 5 years, let's say. Maybe COVID has amplified it, which is that science is taking on a little bit of a different flavor, you know. And what are the differences? Well, Twitter is huge. Twitter, in fact, could have been the inception of this. Maybe the journal eLife and the kind of culture it's trying to generate. BioRxiv, I think, has changed the game. And then I think these online conferences have also, through Conrad and others' amazing efforts with Neuromatch. So I think there's a internationalism and a kind of move away from established fuddy-duddies in universities to a more equal, more inclusive way of doing science, with those avenues I just mentioned. Maybe other people think that there are others. And we'd like to contribute to that. We'd like to take that example and make it even better. And it's one of the reasons we invited Conrad, because I think we owe him and his team a great debt of gratitude towards making everyone realize that we can internationalize science in a way that really needed to be done, in a way COVID just was revealing something latent, I think. So that's really the position we're taking, that those are the questions, the four fields: philosophy of mind, psychology, cognitive neuroscience, systems neuroscience, computer science, AI, the wish for inclusivity, everyone be involved, and hopefully all of us change our minds to some degree in this new space. And I'll stop there.
Ida, you want to tell us more stuff?
Sure. Okay.
Ida, maybe when you're speaking, turn your speaker off.
Does it work now? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Aida Mohamed-Nejad, and I'm very delighted to host Conrad together with John and Joshua today. We are very indebted to Conrad for the sort of initiation of this online tradition of sort of open debate. And another thing that I would just want to add, in addition to the wonderful sort of introduction that John already gave us, is that our goal is to be very much inclusive of people from different disciplines. So if you come from a discipline and you hear something and you don't understand it, feel free to ask for clarification in the chat. And we have two wonderful people who will help us, Brad and Kanaka, and they might address your question, or we might be able to read it, or they will bring to our attention to describe it. We will try our best to ask our speakers to also clarify things. So just to be sure, I'm just sort of echoing what John said with regards to no eye rolling at any questions for clarification, especially. I want to encourage everyone to participate in the spirit of understanding and critique, but also be kind to each other. And I want to say that I personally will not always obviously agree with John and Joshua, and you will see us here disagreeing a lot. And you should know that this is what we enjoy doing, because we used to do this anyway before. And in this way, you might at different points gradually sort of disagree with one or other of us as well, just so that you know what to expect of these sort of sessions. One of the things that was very important to us was to address specifically the question of biological and artificial learning. What are the intersections? What are the places where there is a distinction or a contention between the fields? What are the different subdisciplines in biological and artificial learning? And what is the way forward? And how can we create a forward momentum that doesn't just repeat the chords of the past sort of decades, what we have seen in these fields. And with that, I just pass it on to Josh.
Thanks, Ida. Can everybody hear me? Cool. So yeah, I want to echo everything that John and Ida said. And I will disagree with them vehemently later. But for now, I think we're all in agreement on the goals, the intentions. I'll just add to one of the things John said, this concept of democratizing science has been really near and dear to my heart for a long time. We started the Open Connectome project 10 years ago to try to democratize the data. And that had some successes and some failures, but this is an opportunity to democratize ideas, which are at least as powerful as data and certainly much easier to democratize. As Conrad and others pointed out, we just say we're having a salon, and then we do. And 100 and so people show up, and we have this amazing discussion with brilliant people. So I've been interested in democratizing science, and specifically biological machine learning and the intersections. And I've had these discussions with lots of people over the years, and I'm so excited to be able to do it with everyone here, particularly, obviously, Ida and John and Conrad, and then everybody else who's participating. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming and trusting us with your time. I know everybody has lots of commitments right now with the COVID, and it means a lot to be here, and I'm excited to learn from everybody. Conrad, you're up.
Awesome, great. Well, it's great to be with you here today. I will be talking about two projects, and one of them, and both of them are in a way at the intersection between kind of like an AI way of thinking and a neuroscience way of doing experiments. And so let me share my screen. I hope this will work well. Share screen, share, and then I need to keynote and share that. And unfortunately, I can no longer see you, so I'd love to hear that you actually can hear and see my screen. I need someone to say that into their microphone because I can't see the chat. Okay, great. So today I will talk about some fundamental problems of in neuroscience. So like every project that we ever do, like that any scientist ever does, we don't do that in a vacuum, but we stand on the shoulders of giants. And the first project is about, could a neuroscientist understand a microprocessor? And it really, the title, some people didn't like the title, but the title is just citing where citation is due, which is a fantastic paper, which is called Can a Biologist Fix the Radio, or What I Learned While Studying Apoptosis. It's by Yuri Lazepnik at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. And it's beautiful at thinking about the logic of science. Yuri focuses on like how molecular biology and apoptosis in particular are thinking about like the flow of information, if you will want to paraphrase it like that. And in a way, like they focus on they focus on like, I take a system, I destroy something, I see what happens, and I try and produce a diagram out of that. And the diagram that and this was a thought experiment, a diagram that an apoptosis researcher could come up with for a radio might look like this, where you have like signals going through various processes that all get like a little abbreviation. Molecular biologists really like 3 or 4 character abbreviations, and that is a model of the radio. And the question was, can a biologist fix a radio, with a strong connotation that no, they couldn't. And but this was a thought experiment. And Eric and me were big fans of Lazepnik's work, and we decided to actually make it happen. So what we did is we took the microprocessor, the 6502, and we used it as our model system. And we basically did the kinds of experiments that neuroscientists do on brains on the microprocessor to see what we'd learn about that, following the thought experiment of Lazepnik, who asked what would happen if we would study a system like a radio. So we actually understand from an engineering perspective microprocessors pretty well. Now we have main memory on the outside. We have a memory interface that gets stuff out of the memory and stores it back. We have an instruction part. We have an instruction decoder, which basically takes, oh, what I should do is like, the command is add 3 to register 2. What that now means is like I put these following electrical wires to on and these others for offs. We have registers, which is like the local memory in the microprocessor, and we have the math unit, the ALU, and ultimately control signals go to the ALU. It comes back. And we not only have like this big high-level model of how the microprocessor works, we really have a very satisfactory multi-level model for that. We have 1-bit adders where bits are being added. They consist of logic gates. The logic gates consist of like, here we have, for example, the AND gate, which consists of transistors. And now the transistors ultimately have a reflection in the hardware that we have there. And each transistor has some very relatively well understood dynamical properties. So now let's kind of do mock neuroscience on a microprocessor. We have 3 behaviors: Donkey Kong, Space Invaders, Pitfall. Now you can say in these things, all kinds of things happen in the microprocessor. And that's true. But if I do 2 alternative choice division tasks, all kinds of things happen in my brain. If I do a memory recall stuff, tasks, all kinds of things happen in our brain. So it feels somewhat similar. And then the first thing that we did is lesion studies. Neuroscientists do a lot of lesion studies. What we found is that there's a lot of transistors. If we lesion them, none of the 3 behaviors starts anymore. Not like the microprocessor doesn't have the capability to boot Donkey Kong. If none of them works anymore, we have this as just a black dot. Now, if lesioning it only prevents Donkey Kong from starting, we colored it blue. If it only prevented Pitfall from booting, we called it red. If it only prevented Space Invaders from booting, we colored it green. And what we saw here is we saw some specialization. Now, you see what the point is. In neuroscience, when we do those lesion studies, we're willing to make far-reaching conclusions. If we lesion it, X doesn't work. Therefore, there must be some kind of a specialization for X. The role of the brain region must be X. But here, it's clear that that statement is insane. Like a transistor is involved in adding a certain bit to another bit, maybe. That's what the transistors like in the bottom left do, for example. But so that idea would be wrong. Now, maybe it's right for the brain, but we don't know. There are certain assumptions, and if I had much more time, I could go through them precisely. There's certain assumptions that we need to make this kind of logic be correct, the logic of specialization. But that logic is clearly not true about the microprocessor, because this idea of like specialization for a game doesn't even make sense here. And in the same way, we are not thinking hard about what it means if in neuroscience we have a certain lesion result. Spike data. Now we can take the transition from the off to the on state, arbitrarily call it spike data. And yeah, the data, if we look at this in the microprocessor, looks remarkably similar to brain data. Like it looks like spikes. I went to a conference, gave that to lots of people, asked them what they think, which brain area it is. They think that basal ganglia is the best candidate for that. But you see, it's kind of rich and kind of weird. So let's see what else we can do with it. We can do tuning curve analysis. We take a transistor and we see, as a function of the luminance of the last written pixel, what's the activity of one of the transistors. And of course, we chose the well-tuned transistors to show you here, which is in line with what neuroscience papers do. And we find some transistors with relatively simple tuning to luminance, like the blue, the green, and the red one. And we find some with more complex ones, which is what we have at the bottom here. Now, in neuroscience, again, we will usually interpret such findings functionally, where I can say, okay, I have some area, the neurons are tuned to color, therefore the role of the brain area must have something to do with extracting color. Again, this shows like, this is clearly not what the transistors do. Now let's be very clear about it. It again shows an epistemological problem here, which is, how should we interpret the existence of tuning curves? And therefore, like, what we can know about brains is maybe much more limited than what we said before. Now, let's look at correlations. Now, like, you can say we have correlations between pairs of pairs of transistors. Some of them have high correlations, others have low correlations. And indeed, what we find is, if we then look at a number of neurons spiking at a certain period of time, it happens that many times there's like a lot of them spiking at the same time, sometimes a relatively small number of time. There's much more like global events happening than would be predicted based on a shuffle. And again, neuroscientists have done these things and concluded all kinds of things about brains. Then we can look at local field potentials and power spectra. Now, like local field potentials, trivialist interpretation would take the local activity, all transistors in that area, add it up together. That gives us the temporal traces in blue, green, red, and yellow, and so forth. And what we find is they have roughly power law spectra. We have 1/f spectra, which is often interpreted to mean very strong things about brains. Well, microprocessors have it too. We can also use network inference techniques. So for example, we can take these 5 signals that we get there, and we can apply Granger causality to it. And we get a network for Donkey Kong, a network for Space Invaders, and a network for Pitfall. Now, these networks share certain components. For example, a strong error from signal 1 to signal 2. And then there's some modulation by the task. Now, we know for the microprocessor that this means absolutely nothing here. It's just like purely an epiphenomenon. This way of thinking about the network isn't helpful when thinking about how the microprocessor works. Now, there might be assumptions. Now, for all the techniques that I talk about it, there are assumptions under which we learn something real about brains, and there's assumptions for which we wouldn't learn something real about the brains. But neuroscience is virtually void of discussions on under which circumstances, say, is a tuning curve indicative of, let's say, the mode of operation of the brain? Under which circumstances is a lesion indicative about it? Under which circumstances does a network inferred with Granger causality, or insert your favorite really complicated data analysis technique, under which circumstances does it mean something profound about like computation in the brain or the microprocessor? Now we can take the whole chip. Look, in a way, like the microprocessor is much better for us than what we do in neuroscience, because we can do any possible experiment. We can perturb everything. We can record absolutely every transistor's output. It's the ultimate in experimentation. We can take the whole microprocessor and record from every transistor. And indeed, if we then apply methods for dimensionality reduction, non-negative matrix factorization, we do find something interesting, which is we find 2 different signals relating to the clock, and we find a signal relating to the read-write signal. Now, this is all good, but this isn't really the kinds of things that we are looking for as neuroscientists. And I carry deep worries about the techniques that we use in neuroscience not really asking the right questions. Now, let me briefly defend the paper against the obvious attacks that we will hear very, very soon, which is that neuroscientists do all these cool ways of thinking about brains. Yes, as a group, there's incredibly creative work that is really logically great, happening all the time. But the vast majority of studies that I see in neuroscience take a very unreflected perspective, where they basically copy an experimental design that has been found a long time ago without asking what really we learned from the data. And I argue that the microprocessor paper highlights something wrong about the epistemological basis of neuroscience. And I look forward to discussing that. Now, let me briefly give you the highlight of a second paper. This is about what does it mean to understand a neural network together with lily-crab. Why am I talking about that? So basically, this first paper, the microprocessor paper, to me, suggested that a lot of things that we do as neuroscientists are probably not on a great path. And that led me in a lot of follow-up projects to basically try and get at clarity of what it is that's going wrong. And the paper with lily-crab is one that I think is really important here. So, and I only have 3 minutes for that, so let me very quickly go through it. What questions can we answer as computational neuroscientists or as scientists in general? Well, we can only answer questions that have compact answers. Why? Humans can only understand small models, can only communicate small models, can only read books about small models. And the hypothesis space is just really, really big. So let's talk about heavy-tailed descriptions of things. Tic-tac-toe. Exciting games. My kids, like the smallest is 7, they have lost interest because tic-tac-toe is really easy. Why? There are 255,000 distinct games. You will never play all of them. But it's very compressible. No? Like, if I can choose the winning move right now, win. If I can prevent you from winning right now, prevent you from winning right now. Otherwise, when in doubt, take the middle. And when still in doubt, take a corner. Now, if you take those 4 rules, you will never be beat at tic-tac-toe. Now, so it's a very compressible game. Now, I can take this high-dimensional space of potential games, put it into low-dimensional space. Now, the game of Go, people, of course, tried the same thing. And in fact, you can buy thousands of books on Amazon about like details of Go. For example, about the concept of thickness. Now, in such scenarios, the scenario might be very different, where you could say, sure, like the most important rule is if I can win, then win, and if I can avoid losing, then don't lose, and so forth. But in such games, the correct description of it might contain an arbitrary number of rules. Now, the question is, are there a few rules, and with every rule, I shave away like half of the remaining variance? Or could it be that I need an arbitrary number of rules? You know, like the 100 most important rule might be thickness. And hey, this is important enough that all the Go grandmasters probably agree on thickness, and like there's books written about it. But number 1 million could still be something that is shared between all the Go grandmasters, in which case there can be no like compact theory of how to play Go. Now, let's talk about understanding neural networks. Now, you can say, in computer science, we have lots of approaches to estimate compressibility. We want to only briefly touch on that. We can use, say, distillation techniques. And indeed, we can take a neural network that maybe has millions of free parameters and make it smaller by a factor of 10 to 100. But it's a small amount of compression, which means now I'm saying that if we take a neural network that can solve the task that humans can readily solve, it cannot be small enough for humans to understand. And I know that this is a very old argument. It's just like that I believe that we can be more precise about it now. You can also, and we can empirically say how many bits we appear to need to, let's say, be good at solving, let's say, ImageNet problems. But like, there's a large space of problems that are more interesting. We can also say approach it from the other end, where you could say, well, how much information do we believe we store? Let's say 10 bits per second. Some people argue for more, some people argue for less. 30 years of life until like I look at your brain. So you'll have 10 to the 10 bits. That would be 10 to the 4 books. It's clearly more books than you could ever read. That assumes that you accumulate independent information at 10 bits per second. If you think you only accumulate 1 bit per second, that would be 10 to the 3 books. But what that means is if this is independent information, that there cannot be a model that performs at Conrad's level that you could compress into a really small number of books. Now, I should say a little of how I hope to get out of that. Arguably, all the bits that we have in, many of the bits that we have in our brain don't come through evolution, or they don't come from the way we are born, but they come from the stimuli that we interacted with, and arguably we can understand the learning algorithms that are there. Argument in a nutshell, read up Richards et al. If you want to see why we believe that if we have a neural network, it's really easy to describe it by the PyTorch code that makes it. It's very hard to describe it by the binary matrix of weights that are between the neurons there. And the takeaway, and I think it's a good way of kicking off the Salon with that, I think we should worry about philosophy. We should deeply worry about philosophy. Philosophy is a great fit for salons, and getting philosophy wrong is a way of setting up a field for failure. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Conrad. That was brave of you. So, okay. If I recall, Josh, you had a journal club just leading up to this, where you discussed the first paper. Is that right?
That's right.
So it seems to me that you're fresh and brimming with all sorts of criticisms and concerns that came. So maybe, if it's okay with Ida, with you, we maybe find out what happened in the journal club that you had, Josh.
Sure. I'd love to report. I just say that the journal club consisted of a number of people in my lab, Ida, Kanika, and one of Kanika's students, and so I'm reporting on behalf of everybody. These aren't necessarily my ideas. I'll take credit for the bad ones and blame for the whichever way it's supposed to be. I'll take blame if I say anything dumb, but the credit goes to everybody else. So I'll first just start and say I really do love the paper. I thought it was very thought-provoking and very interesting, and I think that the question is brilliant. I think the answer is nonsense, and for a number of reasons, and Conrad and I have talked about this before, but I don't think it actually captures the way that neuroscientists do experiments. I think neuroscientists ask a really clear question, or try to. They try to design an experiment that gets them the answer, and then they use whatever machine learning tools we have accessible to us to answer them. And the way that Conrad, the kind of straw man argument that Conrad puts up is that neuroscientists basically throw a bucket of data over at some algorithm and hope the algorithm somehow infers how the brain works across scales. And I think that's just not really the way neuroscientists work. On the flip side, I will say that, kind of the greater point of that, lots of neuroscience seems to be epistemologically flawed in various ways, and that, in a sense, the community as a whole does seem to be banging our head against the same drum of a small subset of kinds of experiments using single neuron physiology and a few different models with the relatively similar experimental paradigms. And not making as much progress as perhaps we could if instead we took a more varied approach where we did things such as what Conrad alluded to in the Lillicraft paper, and other just more various techniques, more various kind of philosophical approaches to understanding the brain, that we can make a lot more progress as a field. And I think there's a certain kind of myopic, maybe closed-mindedness that different disciplines of neuron feel like they're the ones. It has to be this scale, this temporal scale, this spatial scale. We're the ones that are really going to figure it out. And I think that probably collectively we're going to figure it out, not any individual scale, any individual approach.
So I think I should be given a chance to reply to that. So I think there's a selection bias at play here. So Josh is one of the super creative statisticians, always building new approaches, one after another. I think he's just hanging out with really weird people. Let me highlight how unbelievably single-mindedly unreflected neuroscience is. If you look at tuning curve mapping, let's first see the scale. So within systems neuroscience, and I include fMRI to that, arguably the field has been completely dominated by tuning curve mapping and rather unreflected one on top of that. So what do I mean with that? So Huber and Wiesel did something new, which is they tried weird stimuli and they managed to drive V1. What happened in the 50 years afterwards is that for every for every brain area that has a name, that had a name before, and a lot of brain areas that didn't have a name before, someone got insanely famous for having stuck an electrode somewhere, change the stimulus in some way, and say like, oh, look, this is like when I have dots moving, but if I have lines moving, it's not happening. Or like, this is an area where faces work great, but like shoes don't work. So this is a large proportion of the people who are famous in systems neuroscience. They didn't ask themselves, what exactly does that mean to have those tuning curves? Every paper comes with like, now we figured out how color works. The papers are like full of allusions to mechanistic insight coming from there being a correlation. They didn't even bother to make sure that they go through all the different dimensions that those neurons could also be tuned for. Instead, there was like this folk idea of like what each brain area does. Now that people scale up approaches, we see it look very differently, where all of a sudden we basically see, oh, there's like actually like lots of brain areas that care about rewards and lots of brain area that care about behavioral state and so on and so forth. So yeah, no, like basically, Josh, show me the papers, show me the proportion of papers that really think, okay, I want to argue. Now, like most papers have a mechanistic statement where they're like, this, therefore, this is how the brain works. And they have evidence for that mechanistic statement. I did the following experiment and found the following results. That bridge between mechanistic statement and like what they actually did is highly problematic philosophically. And for me, the microprocessor paper really nicely highlighted why this is so confusing.
So it's actually very interesting, right? There was a book written by an Israeli philosopher whose name I forget, who talked about how important it was to take people's personalities into account with respect to the kind of science that they like, right? And I think there was no doubt, even when I first, Conrad very kindly shared drafts of the paper that he and Eric were writing, that it was going to rub people the wrong way, right? But I do think that it's very important to take Conrad at his word, which is that he ended his talk by talking about sort of philosophy, right? And I think hiding in Conrad's paper were a series of very important points that mustn't be lost because one can pick holes in particular aspects of the paper. They didn't run a whole game playing session. There are techniques that could have been integrated. There were some that were left out, obviously, right? But there was nevertheless a very important point made, which is if you want to come up with some kind of compressible sentence or paragraph to talk about how that microprocessor works, then I think Conrad was absolutely right, Eric and Conrad, that you're going to have to talk about it at the level of its more abstract functional design. What Robert Cummins and other philosophers have talked about, it's functional analysis. Okay. The question then is, and if I understood what you said, Conrad, basically the fetch, decode, execute logic of the microprocessor that anyone and an undergrad in engineering would talk about. Okay. The point is how would you best work out the functional level of the object? So, churches have a particular set of features that don't care if the church is made out of bricks or made out of wood or made out of plastic, right? It has to have some functional components, a nave and such things. Now, the question is, and the point I think this paper made, which I agree with overall, is it's actually really difficult to work out the functional abstract design from the bottom up. Okay, so either you have some very good upper level behaviorally generated theories, which you can then go and look after the fact. And I just want to introduce two more concepts which were implicit in the paper. One is is that if you want to send out all your hounds and get confirmatory evidence at the level of neurons or circuits for your theory at the more functional abstract level, by all means you should. It's a flat evidential landscape. Okay. So in other words, once you have some kind of functional notion, by all means break the tie by going in and doing some either-or experiments with lesions or with neurons. But, and the other concept is the difference, and which is I think what really riles the neuroscientists, is that you can do very good vertical, horizontal work. This is a notion that Cummins, a philosopher, brought in, which is you can do beautiful work at the horizontal level. But what you have to be careful about is to have vertical aspirations for your horizontal work. And so what happens is you can do all that lovely work on the chip and gather all sorts of truths. All those methods that Conrad showed were true facts. But the philosophical error that neuroscientists, I'm sorry, make all the time is that they think that it's easy to do horizontal extrapolation from the vertical details. And I think that most scientists would be happy, well, they wouldn't be happy, but they should be happy. Just do your horizontal work. Do it. But don't be vertically pretentious about your horizontal work. And that, I think, was the deep point of this paper, is that all the horizontal detail is not magically going to give you vertical insights to the abstract functional design. And we're going to have to do the work in a slightly different way. And I've argued you have to go top down and then do confirmatory work at the level of the circuitry or the neurons. But it's not going to work most of the time in the opposite direction. And I think you and Eric should be owed a debt of gratitude for actually explaining with a nice concrete result the difference between vertical and horizontal explanations and how you don't automatically get one from the other.
So I want to start by saying that there's two different sort of categories of things that I want to say. The first is I'm sympathetic to a lot of the philosophical points you're making. I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the sort of critiques of neuroscientific methods being overfitted to a particular small problem and then extrapolated from there. I'm very sympathetic to those. That said, the specifics of the paper, I have some critiques about. So there is the philosophical point and there is the specifics of the paper. And I think it seems like we're all somehow in some form of agreement, but as I see also in the chat, the disagreements seem to be in whether we are being precise about the sort of the critique of neuroscience or not. So just to talk about a microprocessor and 3 games, and let's say Donkey Kong just because of as our sort of handle for it. So when we talk about natural behavior that has evolved and together with the brain that it evolved with, and it has evolved in various species who get a lot of brain damage throughout their lives. Usually when you lesion some area, it doesn't shut down the whole system. The system doesn't stop booting. On the other hand, when you have a particular software, a behavior that has a particular algorithm, if you basically, you can figure out how to change aspects of that behavior by impairing some parts of it. So there is a difference between that and the microchip in that it's not that if you just damage some part of my prefrontal cortex, I just don't wake up anymore. There are some parts of my brain that are that off button, just don't get into my brainstem. But the rest of it, it seems like there's a lot of it that doesn't. Another point on that, again, it's similar, it's in the same sort of realm, which is that Donkey Kong is one of virtually infinite number of games you could sort of build on the same microprocessor. Humans, I'm one of the people who argues for specialness of human architecture in the sense that it can have a lot of different algorithms on the same hardware. But I think in some animals, there is more limits on how many algorithms you can actually have on the same hardware. And so there are limits. The kinds of software that you can actually arrive at on these animals is much more limited by the hardware in ways that they have co-evolved together, in fact. So there is a closer relationship there, as opposed to humans and Donkey Kong being on the end of this, where a microprocessor is just not evolved for Donkey Kong. It's just like it's built for other purposes. Donkey Kong happens to be one of those things. So I wonder whether you should have lesioned the software, like a for loop, and figured in order for this to be actually sort of comparable, as opposed to lesioning the entire microprocessor. So one for loop would have made that particular sort of screen shut down. One for loop might have, lesioning another sort of line might have made the color go off, etc. Right? So I do wonder about the precision of the analogy, and I do wonder whether the precision of this analogy actually matters for the strength of the kind of critique that we can make about neuroscience on the basis of this particular paper. And I'm going to reiterate again, in spite of the fact that I'm very sympathetic to philosophical points and not sticking to an overfitted number of methods that have been developed for identifying individual cells. Although those studies in themselves have been useful, I don't do those kinds, and I don't think that we should overfit all of our methods to them. I think still the critiques that I mentioned maintains for the paper.
Yeah, so let's go at, you made a whole bunch of points, beautiful points. But let's say the first thing that's obvious. The brain isn't a microprocessor, no? And we never made that point, and that would be a really stupid point. The crux of the question is, are there things that we know to be true about the brain that fix a logic that we know to be wrong for the microprocessor? Okay, and now let me get at the parts of your argument. Now, there was one part, like, should we have perturb for loops? Well, take humans. Should we perturb, or like animals, should we perturb cells or brain areas, or should we perturb the thoughts? Maybe the right way of doing experiments is like go and say apple, and that's like a perturbation, and like use that as a means for perturbation. But we don't know that. Now, like, we still do optogenetics, and we still do single cell perturbations, and we still do electrophysiological perturbations. So is that level of uncertainty, are we perturbing at the right level? That is a problem that is perfectly shared between analyzing brains and analyzing microprocessors. No one knows that we perturb the right thing. No, maybe we should perturb manifolds. In fact, like, I'm sure we have a lot of people in the audience that think we should perturb manifolds. Maybe we should perturb thoughts at the very high level, and I'm sure we have people in the audience that think we should do that. Maybe we should perturb what single cells do. Maybe we should perturb single molecules in the synaptic cleft somewhere. So the problem exists. Neuroscience hasn't been very good at convincing us that their perturbations are at the right level. So keep in mind, this paper, it's not about microprocessors. I don't overly care about like, playing with microprocessors is great. I think everyone should test the algorithms on microprocessors. But like, I'm not making the point that they're identical. But I'm making the point that if the logic is wrong on the microprocessor, you better be able to give me a really good, as a neuroscientist, you better give me a really good reason for why the problem that occurs with the microprocessor couldn't happen if we did it on a human. And the second point that you mentioned, which is beautiful, is about evolution and co-evolution. And it's true that in biology, we have two kinds of causation. And there's Ernst Mayr wrote a beautiful book about it. It's called What Makes Biology Unique. It's a fantastic book that I'd recommend for everyone. You can say in biology, there's two arguments that are permitted. The first one is I look at it and I see the following, and that's what it means. And that's the bottom-up thing. No? I look at the data, I do my measurements, gives me insight. There's another way of gaining insights that is like, I have understanding about the ecological niche in which something is happening, which constrains the set of realistic models. Zizek is making a third argument, which is like a historical argument, which is if there's other animals that I understand in a way, it allows me to carry over some understanding from them onto the others. Now, all of them, I could make the argument that it's the same for the microprocessor. Now, like, the microprocessor doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the background of people already coding microprocessors. And therefore, the kind of primitives that are given on microprocessors are colored by the way humans code text, code programs. And in fact, if we think about like human needs when coding in early processors, we might learn a lot about the architecture of a processor. But the question is, let me go one step further and take what you say for granted. It would help us if we would know something about the co-evolution and so forth. Show me the neuroscience papers that productively use such insights to make progress at interpreting data.
I just want to say one thing, Conrad. To defend you one more time. I mean, I don't think either. I certainly don't think Josh or Ida have to review one fraction of the traditional neuroscience papers that I have to. So I believe that they're in a slightly, I find it quite ironic that and I have argued that understanding, if you believe it's that algorithmic flow diagram for the microprocessor, is that people do, I think, want some algorithmic sense of what's going on, right? I'm going to step out on a limb and go that people kind of want an algorithmic flavor to their explanations. And you made the case that it's extremely difficult to reproduce that algorithmic flow diagram from the kind of data that you showed. And I can tell you, vast numbers of neuroscience papers, Josh, never get close to an algorithmic sentence at the end of all their data gathering. So I think empirically, and I once counted papers in a journal that I won't mention to see, and it was woefully small number. Okay, so from an empirical standpoint, I actually think that Conrad's on good ground. This is an unusual audience because everyone's operating way up at level MAR 1 and 2. Okay, and what Conrad was doing is saying MAR level 3 is a very difficult place to make 1 and 2 inferences about. Okay, so I mean, I think that was really, and I think just the irony of the kind of extremely concrete attacks that paper got, the kind of attacks it got, in a way, revealed the truth of his criticism, because he got the same kind of logic that neuroscientists engage in attacking it. They didn't see the broader philosophical point, so they got all concrete on his ass about microprocessors, right? But that wasn't really what he was doing, right? So I think, in a sense, the paper revealed two things: the problem of going from implementational levels up, and the fact that people are just so concrete when they read what was basically a scientific fable.
May I, John?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I tend to think that, again, the philosophical point is well taken. I do think we need some level of precision. And I think that in your response, Conrad, you misunderstood what I was saying. I wasn't saying that evolution binds hardware and software in biological creatures, therefore neuroscientists have done a great job of using this. No, I was saying neuroscientific methods that perturb at certain levels are more likely to reach the software level perturbation because of the fact that these two things are closer to each other, especially in lower level creatures. There is a notion of natural behavior in biological creatures such that that doesn't exist in a microprocessor. It just doesn't have a notion of a natural behavior. You can define whatever on top of it. So that was the point. It doesn't have to do with claiming anything about papers that do it better. I think that critique holds. In addition to something that you said, it seemed like you were saying it in defense of the paper, but I think that's a critique of the paper, which is the idea of level of perturbation. So in neuroscience, you're totally right that there are fewer people who work at this level or that level. It's just like some people prefer to work at the level of cells. Some people like to overclaim or overfit what happens at the level of cells to the entire sort of complex functions. I'm not one of those people, obviously. Some of us, like me, I like to work at the level of algorithms, then test in behavior, and then test in at the level of neurons. So go from the top down. There are different approaches. So I don't think that there is a unified way in which all of neuroscience is using one level, and there is no way in which all of them are using it for the same reason. So there's reasoning behind why would I perturb at this or that level. And behavioral perturbations are pretty similar to yelling apple to someone. So I think that you're totally right in identifying that there are different levels of perturbation. My understanding is that I didn't see that, I think, in the paper. I think that you were mentioning understanding and what is the notion of understanding a system, but you weren't mentioning that depending on your goal, you can perturb at different levels. And do I think that's a huge thing that makes your paper sort of unreadable? No. So at the philosophical point, yes, it still stands. But I think it's also, I empathize with people who think, oh, but the analogy is not quite right, in spite of the fact that it provokes a lot of thought. So those were the two things that I wanted to say. I think that there's a misunderstanding of what I meant by the link between behavior and sort of, I guess, I would say natural behavior, software, hardware in biological creatures versus microprocessors. And second, different levels also exist in neuroscience.
I think maybe because there's an enormous number of questions coming in, maybe, I don't know, Josh, Ida, how you should do this, but maybe Brad and Kanaka can maybe guide us into the ordering of the questions for Conrad, because there's a lot coming in, and I'm not anywhere near as good as some of you veterans on this kind of platform on how to prioritize the questions. So
questions are upvoted, but I just want to say that Adrian Farrell has been saying a lot of interesting things, and maybe once we address the top voted questions, we could perhaps have their perspective too.
Of course, I'd listen to Adrian at any time. She could go to the top right now. Okay, so should we go to the list and just go in order? Is that how it works?
Can I say one more thing, just kind of defending Conrad a little bit before we get into further criticisms of his work and his intellect and his humanity? So I think, there's a really important point that he makes is this one that I strongly believe in, is that it takes all kinds. And the reason I believe it takes all kinds is because I'm a very particular kind, and if it doesn't take all kinds, I'd be pretty worried that it doesn't take my kind, and that would be bad existentially for me. And so I think Conrad's bigger point is it takes all kinds, not just of humans with different diversities, backgrounds, intelligences, and perspectives, and experiments as well. And what is the right distribution as a field for us along all these dimensions of models, species, experimental approaches? And I think Conrad's saying there's inequality. There's basically a neuroscientific inequality where we focus almost all of our resources in this one particular kind, and that we should really have a more social justice, democracy kind of perspective where we really invest in lots of different ideas from lots of perspectives, and we'll make more progress together as a field. And I think as much as I like disagreeing with everybody else on screen, I think we all obviously agree to that. And the question is, how do we get there, and how can we promote that idea more?
But that's why we wrote this paper. No? Like I'm 100% with Josh. Like, why did we write that paper? We have seen, both Eric and me, basically thousands of tuning code mapping papers that just did the very same logic, new brain area. It's not very long ago that you could get a Nobel Prize for tuning code mapping. It's similar with other ideas. Like, I have seen so many people take MRI data, put it into some algorithm, gives you like a nice little diagram with stuff, and then they say things about it. The problem is, like, we have these things that are just as philosophically maybe problematic as many other disciplines, but all of a sudden they like eat up half of neuroscience. And once we're in that situation, it's basically important to say, like, nice approach you have there, but you don't have like the foundations built. And it just turns out that the foundations for tuning code mapping are not properly built. The foundations for functional connectivity on fMRI data is not properly built. And that's why we need like more people questioning these things. And Eric and me suddenly believed that by pointing out that the logic is fundamentally flawed, it will help the field kind of move away from these like overhyped simplistic experiments.
100% agree.
Ida, do you want to, are you aware of the questions that are being voted up to the top and want to address some of them?
Sure. So I think the first question is, the top voted question is Brad's question. He says, Conrad, what do you think we are looking for in neuroscience? Is it even definable?
This is fantastic. In the Lillicrap paper, we have a very well-defined definition of what, at least implicitly, a lot of computational neuroscientists will agree with. We felt it's like the best distillation of what we had into like concrete, mathematically definable things, which is we want to take data from the brain. Oh, hey, Brett.
Hey.
We want to take data from the brain, put it into a model of such a nature that the model has two properties. The first one is we can understand it, so it can be printed into a book that I can read and like make sense out of it. The second one is if we then implement that, Python implementation comes with the book on the CD-ROM if you want. We put it in, it actually works. There's one operational definition for what we're striving for. There's lots of different definitions. Not like in the Richards paper, we rather say we want, can you guys mute yourselves? I have bad echo on my side. If in the Blake paper, we rather say one way of defining the goal would be that we have a learning algorithm that produces like human-like performance if confronted with like the same stimuli and that is compact. But yeah, the problem is no, we have like a clear drive towards compact models, but we at the same time have a clear drive towards models that work. And jointly, they kind of make that space of how progress could look like very difficult.
Right. So am I coming through?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I'm always thought back to the example of the simplest way to build a model of the brain is just to have a baby, right? Like I mean, there you have a complete thing, right? So if your goal is to create, I mean, let's imagine that you could create this Python algorithm that would essentially simulate the fundamental properties of a mind. Presumably, that code would be way too complicated for a person to understand. Right, so I think that simply the goal of just creating that one system that you could hand over to someone else physically still doesn't quite get us to where we want to be as a field, because we need that information to be digestible in some way. I guess, are you assuming that all of the information, are you specifying also that everything within that specification, on that CD-ROM, would be understandable by the sort of average computer programmer? With not like dedicating their life to that process of understanding that code?
I'm perfectly fine with someone dedicating their lives. Not like all of us have dedicated our lives to that very problem. Like that's okay. If not every coder can understand it, but Brad and Josh can understand it, my life would be well spent. I would write this book that the two of you would read it and like, yeah, that's how the brain works. And you'd buy me beer and we'd all be happy.
Should we go to the next question?
Do you want to? I thought you said Adrian had some good questions. I don't know if they're official.
Yeah.
Questions.
So Adam Charles is next, and then Adrian on the chat said that they would be comfortable with staying on chat, but we can ask them again. Maybe in the meantime, while you guys are asking, Adam Charles might want to come to ask this question. Adam,
Adam doesn't seem to be able to be added, so maybe you can say his question on his behalf.
Okay. So he's asking, aren't the most important lesion studies the ones where the animal does more than fail to boot? And then there's a bunch of conversations underneath this.
So again, this question falls a little bit into the, couldn't you have done more awesome physiology on a microprocessor class? Now, like, yes, it would have been like super interesting to look at, maybe like if we are in games where like you can die by fire, we could find that there are like certain like that there's certain lesions that only make the game not realize that fire would kill you, and your character runs around, but like it runs to the fire, doesn't die anymore, or something. Like, sure, like those things are more interesting, and I'm totally with you that like the most interesting things in humans or animal lesions are not just the ones where like the animal is dead, but like that very specifically blocks you in one task, and there's like similar tasks where it doesn't block you. But even there's like an unavoidable uncertainty about which other things could distinguish the lesion and the non-lesion case. And like we're always good, like we're always good at saying this neuron is different if I show blue versus red. Easy. We can very quickly establish that. We're notoriously bad at saying the difference between these two things doesn't affect anything else. And the same thing is true for a lesion. Like I lesion some area, you can do a memory task of one kind, you cannot do the memory task of the other kind. I do a few tasks and you seem similar. That in no way rules out that there aren't other things that will equally load on that lesion.
The next question is very similar, I guess, in spirit. So I'll just mention it and maybe you want to address that. But, the person says that you basically address this, but I'm just going to read it. It's from Aaron Wong, and they asked, wouldn't a better comparison to neuroscience be whether you can play the game where you can examine input-output relationships rather than just seeing whether the game boots? But then you answer that question. So I'm going to go to a question by Zach Zeisler. I'm doing the German pronunciation. I hope that's correct. I've been reading Bojaki's The Brain from the Inside Out, which posits another similar epistemological issue with neuroscience, that we are trying to map human-invented concepts onto brains that may or may not work that way. This seems to align well with Conrad's idea about not studying the brain in the right way. How do we resolve this conflict?
Yeah, so let me first highlight why it's necessary. So in science is impossible unless we're in a small space. Like if the space of models that we have is arbitrarily big, there's almost nothing that we can have. So therefore, neuroscientists, just as well as most other scientists, come with using their own narrow categories and hoping to find something there. I'm 100% on board with Bojaki's critique there, that basically there is no reason that in human language, the correct models of how the brain work need to be correct. At some level, we overestimate our ability to guess what the right dimensions are. And if you want, like we find that, like now people record from more and more neurons. They record in higher dimensional stimulus spaces. The general finding is that like all kinds of neurons code for all kinds of things. Sure, there is still a tendency towards specialization. No, there's more auditory neurons in auditory cortex and more visual neurons in visual cortex. But that strict mapping onto like simple human words just doesn't work anymore. And the more we move towards like more complex stimuli, the more we find that these old categories just don't work anymore. And that's it's a central logical mistake in neuroscience that like if you want the fable, as I believe John called it, like highlights that basically the fact that we can change something in the stimulus or in some dimension, and we find changes in the system, just doesn't afford us to say much about what happens otherwise. And neuroscience typically, like most experiments look at tuning curves. They don't even ask which dimensions we're invariant to. And it's simply infeasible to run through all the other dimensions. And that is like the fundamental cause of neuroscience. And like, as Bojaki says there, like we aren't in this simple low-dimensional space. I mean, like he probably doesn't use those words, but we aren't in this simple space where people can hypothesize what the right dimensions are. And also, if I may say one more thing to that, if we take neural networks, we generally find that if we give more neurons, they do better. The reason why why it helps to have more neurons is it kind of gives the system the ability to pull out more dimensions. Why should we believe that the brain just pulls out the small numbers that humans actually have words for? No, neurons in the human brain will equally pull out lots and lots and lots of dimensions for which we don't have words.
So thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think just for the sake, there are two different points I think you're making at the same time, right, in your responses in the paper. One is, should we be trying to obtain insights about the overall logic of the chip by going in using neuroscience methods at the neural level? In other words, is that a sort of a reductionist fallacy? And I think there are a lot of problems with reductionism, which we can talk about another time. But you're making a second point, which is the Buzaki, the Romain Brett point, that there's something actually problematic about looking at tuning from the point of view of the observer, right, Conrad? So in other words, there are two slightly different, and maybe a third point, which is that we make our experiments simple so that we can get tuning along one dimension and not worry about all the others. But I do think it's important to distinguish between the fallacy of reductionism, to the degree that it is a fallacy, to the fallacy of tuning as seen from an experimental observer, because of course the brain doesn't see both things like the observer does. And then the third is, are we, because we're human, reducing the tuning to a dimension when there are loads of others that we're not seeing? But it just seems to me, if I'm understanding you, those are three somewhat different critiques.
Yes, there's at least those three critiques in it. So the goal of the paper, in a way, was to produce a very touchable, a very real fable for where we have enough distance that we can see the things that we wouldn't find okay. But if we were aliens landing here, we would be thinking about like the neuroscientist versus the brain in a way that is pretty similar to the way many of you think about Eric and Conrad thinking about the microprocessor. That is kind of the story that we're telling here. And yes, it plays with the various, like throughout the paper, it plays with like the various prompts that occur in the fundamentals of neuroscience.
Right, because it ends up that there's so much that was implicit in your paper as well as explicit that, I think a lot of unpacking could be done that would perhaps rile people even more, but maybe reassure people, in fact, that there were points being made that people, if they saw them framed slightly differently, would not disagree with as much as they think they are. Okay, in terms of that list of questions.
Adrian's questions?
The next question is a very good one, and it's by Hessam Akhlaqpour. And he asks, the paper starts by addressing a debate on whether neuroscience is data limited or theory limited. And his question is to everyone on the panel. He says, what are the views of the panelists on this question? So whether neuroscience is data limited or theory limited. I'll go last. Everybody go in however order.
I'm happy to go first. As someone who's looked at maybe amongst the largest amount of data that neuroscientists have, I've looked at hundreds of terabytes of data. I am not particularly data limited relative to the other neuroscientists, and I can say it didn't help very much. At least not me. And I think, Florian Engert made this point to me pretty clearly. He has a connectome of a zebrafish, or at least part of it. He's recorded from every single neuron in the zebrafish brain more or less simultaneously, and he still doesn't know how it works. I would actually say it's not that we're data limited or theory limited. I actually think we're question limited. And I think it's kind of Conrad's point too. which question do we ask of the brain? Because that's what machine learning is. It's a set of tools that allows us to ask questions. And if you ask the wrong question, then you get a nonsense answer. And the theory is hard. Like having a right theory, that's a wonderful thing to have and formalize, but often I find that people with intuition that often don't have a pretty coherent theory can ask much more insightful questions. And so I really think, and not just in neuroscience, in science in general, it's a matter of which question to ask. And when you ask the right question, the answer is often simple and beautiful and doesn't require any data whatsoever. Like the double helix, for example, if you look at that paper, there was no data. It was just a question, what's the structure? And then there was the answer, it's double helix. You know, they stole it from the woman who did it, but the point is that a collection of people asked a really interesting question and the answer was really compelling.
And they get the data from the woman who did it, just to be clear.
That's right. Maybe the question too.
maybe the question too. Yes, not like I completely agree. Like, but let's give the paper a little bit historical flavor. So when the paper came out, roughly at that time, the idea let's do big data was like very fashionable. Now, like by now, a lot of people kind of like saw that this big data hype was like in a way kind of at least not bringing us to where we believed it was. So when we wrote that paper, that was still at the top of the hype cycle about data in a way that the paper starts like that. There was a reaction to us basically saying, if you had the tuning curve for every neuron in the brain, you still wouldn't know what's happening. If you could lesion every neuron in the brain, you still wouldn't know how it really works. If you could like calculate all the correlations in the brain, you still wouldn't know what to do it. So this introduction to the paper in a way is a reaction to the zeitgeist at the time when we wrote it. And now if you ask me, what about now? I'm 100% with Josh. We need the right questions, and we need a debate about what the right questions are. Not like this is like all the papers always give like answers or something, but we don't talk much. And I hope that here in the Learning Salon we will have a lot of that. A debate about like what the right questions are. What are the questions for which answers can exist? For which to which level are there questions to which answers cannot exist? And both the paper with Blake and the paper with Tim Lillicrap ultimately try and brainstorm of like what the right questions could be. No, we may be wrong. With all likelihood we are wrong, but like at least we're kind of pushing against this. Which questions could we feel comfortable with?
So it's interesting. I hope this isn't too personal, but Florian Engert very kindly invited me to his retreat as a speaker. And he and I had been in discussion because he sort of said what Josh said, which is he had indeed worked out the whole connectome. And then he wrote a paper, which was, if I remember correctly, was about rheotaxis in the fish. In other words, how do they detect displacements in the flow of water that they're in? And they did a very beautiful, purely behavioral study plus modeling to work out what signal were they actually working with in order to deal with the displacements in the flow of water or whatever it was. So he published a paper on that. And he had a kind of epiphany, which he said to me, which was that you had the question first, then you did the behavioral experiment and the modeling, and then you had some clue as to what to look for in the connectome. And they had the library. In other words, there's a difference between a novel and a library, right? Or a book that you're going to write and the research you're going to do by going to a library. So the connectome showed its usefulness in so much that it could then be referred to in a reasoned way once you had an idea what you were looking for. But what he agreed with was that you could not reverse engineer the algorithm that it was using by looking at all the details, which was, again, the main message of Conrad and Eric's paper, right? And the thing is, and I kid you not, that when he presented this work at Hopkins, I overheard someone say, Where are the neurons? Where are the connections? In other words, they were very unhappy about the fact that he'd committed a form of apostasy and had actually gone behavior, algorithm, and then worried. And I'm afraid that the very fact that that comment got made, again, is proof that people just have this bias towards the foundational level of circuits and neurons, and all the truths will come from there. And all we're talking about is a balance. And you're absolutely right, Josh. There was an intuition. How does that little fish do that? How the hell does it stay there, right? Very simple question. Let's do some experiments and work out how it does it. Well, what part of its surface would it use to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So theories, by the way, in the philosophy of science are not, they don't have to be mathematical. They don't have to be formal. They can be fuzzy. They can be intuitive, right? But I think that flavor of science, I can't believe I'm defending you as much as I am, Conrad. We fight all the time usually, is that go that way, right? And the people who say you should have done more behavioral experiments with the Donkey Kong in the games, yes, but that plays right into the point being made, I think.
So I'm moving to the place where I start to vehemently agree with the philosophical points that Conrad makes. And for that, I want to mention, so I mentioned this earlier to some others. There is a church in Germany, and since 2001, it's playing a piece by John Cage that will end playing it in 2640. And since 2013, there is one chord that has been playing. And this Saturday, as in tomorrow, I guess in Germany it's already tomorrow, maybe it's already changed, the chord is going to change. So the same chord was held since 2013 until tomorrow. And the whole piece it's one piece written by one man, and it's going to last more than 6 centuries. Now, I think that neuroscience is suffering a little bit from the similar thing, which is that some chords, some ideas, some theories, some experimental methods play for many decades, and we don't see as many changes, so to speak, for a very long time. And what I liked about Conrad's paper, or the philosophical point that his paper was making, is that, here are some of the chords that maybe we want to try other chords for a bit. And with that, I want to answer to Hessam's question given that I'm interested maybe in a faster pace of new ideas or theories happening, my bet is on theory and questions. Yes, experiments help it, but I think that it's a composer level issue. Like we need to have theories that are not just slight modifications, just rearranging furniture, to theories that already existed for the past couple of decades, even a century. It's like many of us are basically, and including myself, our work is a follow-up to something that has been around theoretically for a very long time. And I think that one maybe benefit of a place like the Learning Salon might be to think about what are the ways to move forward a little faster. How can we change the chord? How can we have a polyphony where we have multiple chords played at the same time and changing at different scales, so to speak? Just to add to the number of analogies for today's session.
Conrad, are you answering?
No. Sorry, I was following up a chat there, and then I missed the question. I apologize.
Oh, the question was the question by Hessam already. We didn't have a new question. The new question that I could read for you is from Andrew, and he's asking, it's from Andrew, and he's asking, can you specifically lay out how the microprocessor paper suggests we do neuroscience going forward, which is related to what we all just said.
Yeah, like I think, okay, what are the things that we, one way of going forward is basically take the microprocessor paper that, as John pointed out, was a fable for many different things. And like this, John listed 3 of them. I think causality is the 4th one. So there are many of these different problems. Like each of these problems are problems that we need to struggle with. And that means 2 things. for all the problems that are like implicitly mentioned in there, we should, as a field, try and become clarity about like what those problems are. And then we should ask to which level they can be overcome. Now, like John's natural tendencies will be that like he believes that there's a fundamental fallacy in the reductionism that guides the field. It's a great point, and I love his paper on the need for behavior, but it doesn't fully spell this out. We need to take that seriously as a community, and that's like one of the issues that the field has, one of the big, deep logical issues. But we should take all the logical issues that are in the domain of experiments that we currently have, properly think through it, and then see if we can address them. Now, let's say causal failure, that we build models, we take a small set of models, we see which model fits best. We can test them. We can perturb the system. We can see if we can, if our model selection criterion allows us to then test, to then predict what happens when we perturb. And in some cases, we found that to not be possible. And so yeah, I think we just need many more different experiments. But whenever something gets to be popular, we should do two things. We should make sure that it doesn't get over popular and like make sure that we don't scale up those approaches very quickly. The second one is whenever something gets popular, we should really strive to find holes in the underlying logic of that. What happens instead is that the field has like, as soon as a field has a couple of papers, whichever field that is, they all cite one another. Whenever a paper has a weakness that comes afterwards, they don't deal with the weakness. They cite all these papers before, and those are famous people that we love. And that's like, at some level, like the pushback that I get from people in parts is that it's sacrilegious, that I basically take famous people that inspire us, that like gave us the soul as a field, and take them down. And that's unacceptable in a way. And in reality, the fact that the giants of the past become unattackable means that a field may miss logical foundations, and no one ever is entitled to say there's a logical problem. Therefore, everything that's built on it doesn't sit cleanly. That's not possible. That's like the field have been designed to stifle that kind of criticism.
So I have a logical follow-up to that question, which is, let's just say hypothetically you get, you're running, say, the Brain Initiative now, you have $1 billion. So you just said a bunch of kind of abstract things, but concretely, you don't like the way we're doing it. You have $1 billion, what should we spend it on?
Okay, so if we want to produce something that is like a real body of research, we need to find a place where neuroscience can be simple enough that we can use the tools that we have as scientists, which are built for simple systems. Now, where could it be simple? Personally, I believe that studying learning instead of processing might be simpler because at some level, the learning algorithm that we have arguably are upper bounded in complexity by the complexity that we have in our DNA. So personally, if you gave me $1 billion, I would want to invest it into that space of like learning environment and human and performance. But if you ask me generally how we should invest it, I think we should invest it in areas where not too many neuroscientists have been writing similar papers, establish something truly new. And that could be on the network side of things. It could be, say, at the interaction between machine learning and neuroscience. There's a lot of areas that have had almost no interplay so far. But yeah, it's difficult. That's why I'm not writing Henry Markram style like $1 billion grants. I don't have the magical solutions, but I don't want the field to believe that the questionable insights they have at the moment are already the answers. And in a way, we get Henry Markram type things by making that fallacy. We see like a few neurons that have certain properties. We can cluster them into a bunch of groups, and their like human calculation just basically comes out of having enough of them. No, there's like these simple shortcuts will just never work.
I think one thing that, Josh, hopefully with all these marvelous people who are on and the next generation and how would one spend money, I think it's going to have to be more about structure and incentives. In other words, I think we need to find a way to make younger people be safe earlier in their careers, give them longer runways, and be able to fail and have more team science. In other words, it's very ironic, right? When you look at Max Planck's and you look at Allen Institutes and you look at what Facebook and Google were trying to do by picking the most famous scientists they could and giving them loads and loads of money, right? Well, they're half right? It would be good to be able to have money to create long runways of time just to think and get things wrong. And then we would promote what I think you were getting at, which is pluralism, let many different ways of doing science flourish and let people be next to each other. So I think it's structural. We have to make it so you can be wrong, that you can take your time, you can go for a think, not just gather data, don't just do something, stand there kind of reasoning. That's what I would do, is I would make it safer and less threatening and less orthodox for younger people to do science next door to people doing other kinds of science. And God forbid, have philosophers and people in the humanities present in the same building. So that's what I would do with the money. I would create runways and safety and then leave people alone, the sort of Bell Labs idea, rather than saying, what's the right way and what's the right question, and you do this. I think that's what we have to do, because it's just getting so frightening to do science and when you're stressed, you end up being rigid and you end up not daring to be a nonconformist. And then the whole thing just spirals out of control. And that's what I would think. And I hope that we're able to raise that kind of money here, right? For the next gen. Right.
But it's not only money. For example, there is this bias when publishing things. If you don't claim that you understand mechanism, you have no shot at top journals. And it's like every paper over and over again wrongly claims insight about mechanism. And that's just because it's an unspoken contract that every paper must be about mechanism. Why do we have this this set of chains? Why can't we do more interesting normative things? Why can't we do really interesting theory things? We need to give people, in particular the young people, the chance to be bold, not just on the funding side, but also on the publishing side. People need to be able to get an audience for non-standard things. And I hope that the new online initiatives, like what you do with the Learning Salon, Worldwide Neuro, and Neuromatch Academy, that all those will kind of open up paths for people to get out interesting research, even if the bulk of the fields disagrees with them.
And we all have to remember this and be kinder on tenure committees and on promotion committees and on selection. I mean, it's very easy to be idealistic, but I can tell you from bitter experience, when you're on committees and you say, I don't care what paper what journal they published in, tell me what's in it, suddenly people close ranks and they go, well, we don't have the time to actually read the paper. So in other words, I think we all have to be better people. When we forget what it was like to be young and you get promoted, suddenly you pull the ladder up behind you, right? So I think you're right. It's not just about money. It's about changing the way we judge people and the way we promote people as well. But I think the incentive structure is very much a generator of the kind of papers you're objecting to, Conrad.
So there are some more questions. We are at 1.5 hour point. I guess we can go for another half hour because we were thinking this would be a 2-hour thing, but I don't know how Conrad is doing. Just want to make sure.
I'm good. My kids are home now. They can show up on screen any point of time, but it's a fun discussion.
It is a very fun discussion indeed. Just if I may add something to what I said earlier, someone on so Kanaka on the chat thought that what I'm saying is that we just need to produce faster things. So that's not what I have in mind. And they mentioned machine learning seemingly having faster turnaround. I think big ideas, even in machine learning, is very slow. So the biggest ideas that are groundbreaking and change a paradigm, that moves slow in every field. It moves slow in philosophy. It moves slow in sort of, it's scaling a particular idea of neural networks from 80s to the present day. That scaling was a huge effect, and then different algorithms might come fast. But something that is groundbreaking, that's a new thing, that really changes the game, that happens very rarely, actually. And that particular shift is what I was having in mind. So I think like the last time we had that shift was around 2010. And that was when we figured out that, neural networks we have the computational capacity to scale them. And then the biggest maybe sort of advance since then that was that big. I mean, we finally stopped using LSTM all the time after 30 years, and like we're using transformers for 3 years, but it's not as big as like what happened when the neural network started, what happened when RL was introduced as a framework, what happened when, neural networks could scale. So I think that even there, the progress is slow. So what I mean is not just produce as much as possible, but I mean, we need paradigm changing sort of ideas, not just more of the same or scaling or rapid firing of similar ideas. With that, okay, the next question, there's a lot of questions that have equal number of votes. So I'm just going to go with the ones that don't look like something that have been already answered before. And maybe, Jovo, you want to pick one now? Because I've been taking questions for a while, if you feel.
I think you're doing great.
I know, but I'm handing the baton.
I think. Sure, I'm happy to take over the baton. Maybe Kanaka can just tell us. Kanaka, is there one that we should be answering that we haven't addressed yet? Maybe Kanaka's not here. Okay, I'm going to read one from Adrian because I'm not sure we addressed all of her comments, and she said a lot of great stuff. So Adrian, the comment in here is, contrary to this example, there are aspects of neuroscience where descriptions along the lines of Turing curves really do make sense. Photoreceptors transform photon arrival times into electrical signals in rigorously modelable ways. At some point, there's a transition from the efficacy of this description to something else being needed, but it is not fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like, no, like it's another question of but like there could be domains where things are right. Yes, there could be domains, but we just don't know where the border is. Like, sure, if you give me a primary photoreceptor, you could say, I can separate it from the rest of the retina, and I can ask and meaningfully characterize the tuning curve of it, say, in terms of light intensity or brightness, things like this. Now, do I thereby get like a correct description of how it works? No, it's like part of the retina, and as part of the retina, like pretty complicated things can happen. If they couldn't, then Markus Meister wouldn't be writing so many awesome papers, but like there's a lot happening in the retina. So is it possible that like in the retina it's good? Yeah, quite possibly. Like primary motor neurons, the way they interact with the muscles is like pretty regular. So you could say characterizing how like the motor neuron affects the muscle, like tuning curves are like very meaningful. No? Like they're pretty close to what we could call a biophysical mechanism in both cases. Now you can say for the primary motor neuron, the spike goes there, like out comes like the neurotransmitter, it makes the muscle fibers pull. We can describe that and like meaningful deep mechanism. Same thing, not like I have the photoreceptor, and like here the light goes in, and like here we have a molecular cascade that polarizes the cell. the question is kind of how far we can push in from those sites. But I'm with Adrian here. That like for those domains, we can probably describe a lot of variants of what's actually going on and like almost get at a causal mechanistic model by looking at it. And then there's other domains where the middle of the brain, where like that is very hard to see how that could make sense. Great question, though.
There was a wonderful book by Lily Kay, and it's called The Molecular Vision of Life. And it was about the history of Caltech and Linus Pauling, and how Linus Pauling was able to convince the Rockefeller Foundation and others that everything would be explained at the level of proteins. No, I'm not joking. I mean, yeah, right? But she basically wrote this wonderful history about this. And I think, I think the most, instead of proteins, I think for you, Conrad, we could just substitute in the word tuning curves, because you've really used it a lot. And I think the point you're making, and I think it's true, is that, the properties of single units as reflected in tuning curves to artificial stimuli have become almost the proteins and of lots of circuit level neuroscience. And now, of course, we're beginning to see a shift away from that. But nevertheless, I think that if it stops, and you made a point that other people have made, I think David Linden has made this point to me, that when you go to the periphery, these things are very useful, but as you get more and more central, they don't become as useful to explain the phenomena that you're interested in. The question is, when do you have to drop them for something else, right? Without getting rid of them completely. We just can't have a single vision of life, right? We have to have lots of them.
Yeah.
Anyway.
One question that Tara asked, and I think people in the chat thought that that might be a good one to end on, that is in the chat and it's not in the question domain, is can anyone in here direct me to pointers that address how to develop good questions? I think Conrad mentioned his new paper with Blake Richards, I guess, but I think maybe you were talking about the paper with Tim Lillicrap. And so, yeah, so that's her question. And I think a couple of others also were interested in this being sort of the unified.
So this is a fantastic question. Let me first plug something. At Neuromatch Academy, arguably days 1 and 2 spent considerable time talking about like processes for that. But like, what does it mean to have a good question? Or like a good question is a question for which us dealing with the question, grappling with the question, kind of makes us advance as scientists. Now, this is very hard to compactly put into equations. Not like if we could build some algorithm that gives us the best questions, that would be fantastic. I just don't think that would work. But like good questions. Let's enumerate a few things. A good question is a question that not others ask at the same time. If others ask it at the same time, and it's not about like super time sensitive, someone else should answer it. So it's not a good question for me if someone else will have it. In fact, Dijkstra had 3 rules, and one of them is if given some time, someone else at least as competent as you will come around to solve it, you should move on to a different question. Massively violated in lots of areas. I strongly live by it. So a question must be unique. A question should be different from very similar questions. And like there's often like that we ask lots of questions that are just marginally different. Now, like what happens if I do X in this area versus the neighboring area? So we want a question that's like unique in that regard. We want a question if we had the answer to that would kind of lead us into thinking about the world differently. None of these factors is like very easily measurable. No, and maybe John and Josh have like additional criteria for good questions.
If I may just sprinkle somebody else's question that was sent to me, which is, could the understanding obtained to could selecting the right behavior to study be sort of important in this kind of answering the question and posing the right questions, basically? So I guess as John and Joshua want to answer this question, also consider what is the right question and what is the importance of choosing the right behavior for answering this, which is another person's question.
Thanks, Adam. So I would say, kind of following up, Conrad's answer was, I think, mostly about feasibility. Like, you have to be the kind of person that can answer it well. There's two other dimensions from my perspective. One is the impact. Like, just because you can answer it doesn't mean it matters, right? I mean, you'd like to answer a question that will save 1 billion people's lives. And then the third dimension is intrinsic motivation, which is that what you really want to invest your heart and energy into? Because answering these questions will take years. And you're going to sit in front of your computer or by yourself, and you're going to be up all night writing grants or papers. And if your heart's not into it, maybe find a different question. So I think those are two other criteria. But those criteria don't tell you how to find a good question. Those criteria tell you how to filter out the bad ones. There's a different question of how you find the good ones. And to that, I think the answer, it's a bit of a cop-out, but it's just be curious about the world. To give you one concrete example, the other day I was walking and I saw, you guys know what cicada killers are? It's kind of wasp. And it's amazing. This wasp, it stings cicadas in the air, paralyzes them, brings them back to its nest, plants its seeds in them, and then the baby cicada killers eat this paralyzed but alive cicada from the inside out and then fly away. And I saw a cicada killer come and like stab a cicada and paralyze it and bring it back down into its cave or whatever. And I just thought, that is amazing. I have no idea how this wasp, it's got like 100,000 neurons. It's a trivial amount of neurons. Like, all of DeepMind's and OpenAI's neural networks have way more neurons than this. They happen to build them on a mainframe, which probably weighs 500 tons, and it took the amount of energy that it takes to, say, run a car for 5 years to solve like MNIST or whatever. But maybe Go, whatever the problem they solved is. But the point is, this little dude figured out how to navigate, fly, not get eaten by a bird, stab this guy. It's an amazing problem to solve with a tiny bit, and that's a beautiful problem to figure out. And I'm not going to do it. Maybe Ida can do that. It's more her kind of thing. But the point is just being curious about the world, I think, inspires us to ask questions, and then we can filter out the ones that aren't going to be that impactful or interesting.
But I would just say to that is that, I actually thought your WASP example, Josh, was trying to explain what universities do to postdocs, but you actually meant it concretely. We don't promote curiosity, right? In other words, if you talk to students and go, why did you go into neurology or neuroscience? They'll say, I'm really interested in how the brain works. And then you ask them what they mean. But then they're forced to join a lab, and then they're put on a technically difficult question like, let's clone this receptor or something like that. And by the time you're in the trenches with those details, working on a particular problem, your question that was quite idealistic along the lines of yours recedes in the rearview mirror of your life, right? It was your interview shtick rather than something that was going to be kept alive. And then you get interested potentially in your horizontal work, cloning that receptor or recording from those neurons, and your vertical aspiration fades away, right? And you may actually find yourself saying, this particular kind of horizontal work wasn't really what I kind of wanted when I first voiced my vertical dream, right? But because you have to get a job, and because you have to publish, and because once you start on one thing, it's too difficult to change course, you begin to lose sight. And I think that's the problem, is going for a walk in a park and watching a wasp torture a cicada. It's just not what we promote in our students and our junior faculty. I mean, so it's fine to say it, but unless we create an environment where that's allowed. I mean, I always say to people, if your student said, look, I need to leave the lab for a couple of weeks and just go to the library and read, they'd be fired for the most part. Get back to the lab and collect some data. Right, so that's the problem. Is yes, it's curiosity. Yes, it's asking good questions, but we don't infrastructurally create the environment for it.
To follow up on that wonderful comment, first of all, this is the magic of John. He always has his eye on the philosophical and on the vertical. And for those of you who, like me, might not be, oh, Tim Behrens is disagreeing very much with something. So maybe we should read Tim's comment here. Totally disagree that everyone should work on different questions. By far the fastest progress I have seen in the field I work in has come when several people have been tussling with the same ideas. It is the most excitement I have felt in science. I mostly think the way to make an interesting question is to be deep inside a problem and to get frustrated. Understanding the source of your frustration will lead to an interesting question. Any comments on that other than Conrad's kids?
I mean, like, I agree with Tim that if you're all lonely, then it's hard to make progress because you require other people to bounce off by ideas with. But I have not really ever experienced that. So like anything that I've ever seen people study, including probably those cicadas being tortured, attract, as soon as they attract someone, they attract like a small group of people. And it's good to have at least a small number of people, but like I often rather see the opposite, that the groups are like much too big, asking more or less exactly the same questions. And like, yeah, you want to have like this intellectual ping pong where like you give someone an idea, they give you a better idea back. But like, that's not like how I perceive most corners of neuroscience.
I think Tim is absolutely right when you get that mix correct, right? That wonderful feeling of team spirit. It's a big question. Everyone can take a bite out of that big apple, right? But, you know, you should go to some tenure or promotion committees where people say, what's the unique thing that only this person has done that isn't like everybody else? So in other words, obviously, if there are big, juicy questions, then team science is wonderful and it's incredibly nourishing and fun, but there are unique environments for that and we need to have more of them. But I can assure you it's not what promotion committees want to see, that this person worked really well with others, shockingly, right? So it has to be a big question that everyone can feel that they can contribute to. And maybe if it was an idea, like you say, rather than a technique in search of an idea, it would work better.
I was going to add to that I think I'm part of that small sort of field that is very much honestly happy with each other that Tim is talking about. And I think that it's a very fortunate subfield, but there are a lot of other subfields in neuroscience where someone was mentioning earlier in the chat, they're very much of a boys club. So the barrier of entry in the kinds of fields where there's a lot of people working on a topic for a while, especially for people who are, you know, from historically marginalized groups, the barrier is a lot higher. And the ability to innovate there, getting the resources and everything is a lot more difficult sometimes. So I think that there is an issue here of what John was saying with regards to having an environment that's more sort of supportive. Another aspect of it that I think is important is if we have subfields where they get where they have a sort of historically boys club flavor to them, that just it's harder to do anything in them, be it innovation or even being the, I mean, there's no option other than being the cicada, I guess, which is not a great thing. And I think that that's something that a couple of people were mentioning earlier in the chat. And it's something that, you know, we're hoping that this salon is going to address issues of such nature as well. And hopefully it will open up stage for a lot of people that haven't been classically represented when we talk about particular topics in learning.
There was one question from someone in the chat wondering why we've drifted so far from how would a neuroscientist explain a microprocessor. I think that's partially true, but I would also say that at a meta level, the kind of reductionist methodological bias of neuroscience that paper was addressing is, in a sense, a consequence of the ecosystem that we live in. And my guess is if we had more of what we're trying to do here, we would have had more fun with that paper rather than it leading to quite a lot of heat rather than light. So I hope that the link is that more of this kind of back and forth, more of a chance, by the way, of the authors to defend themselves right in front of their peers, would make people realize this. It's not just an attack. It's actually something quite interesting, and we would all learn from it rather than just over defending. So I think there is a link between the meta discussion and the paper, and I'd like to guess that Conrad kind of wanted this kind of discussion when he and Eric wrote this paper. I think this is, I mean, unless I'm wrong, I think he would have liked to know that this was coming.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that Josh already made that comment. So he wrote a papier critique of our paper, and he sort of says, like, you're so mean. You're frustrating the early career researchers by telling them that neuroscience is hopeless. Where in reality, this paper is meant exactly the other way around. It basically says, when you're born into neuroscience, you see this huge orthodoxy where people have asked the same questions, often without thinking very deeply about it. There's all these things you can do to get out of this problem. And in a way, it makes the opportunity going forward better. So in that sense, like, yes, I welcome these discussions, and like, maybe it is. I mean, like, I don't know how the ERCs here on the channel feel, ECRs on the channel feel. No, like, some people will be like, yeah, that's so frustrating. Maybe I want to work somewhere else, and other people will be like, yeah, this is like what I want to like deal with. And like, we'll have to see which factor is bigger.
Well, I think we all agree we want them to keep doing neuroscience because it's hard. And maybe the question that we've been answering the last hour or whatever is not can a neuroscientist, but can the field of neuroscience understand the brain? And I think we all think, to a certain degree, we can certainly make lots of progress, and that will require lots of different people working together. I think basically everyone will see that.
And there might also have been a slight misreading of like what we meant. The question, the paper is not about neuroscience is impossible. The paper is about if we keep doing what we currently do, we are going nowhere. And I think I stand by that second statement. And if the first one sounds in it, no, I'm like hugely optimistic about neuroscience leading to deep insights. It's just like we can't be intellectually lazy on the way there. Okay, guys, I've got to go to lunch to dinner with my family.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for organizing this. This is a huge service to the community. This will be awesome.
Thank you so much for being our first inaugural guest.
Thanks, Conrad. I hope you don't feel like you're walking off too bruised.
We all do.
Looks okay. Okay, guys. That's fine.
Good night.
Ciao. Bye.
All right. Does anybody want to do an outro? Any closing words, summaries?
I think it went great. I love it.
And we'll post about who's next, right? And yeah, and maybe talk offline about how to post the papers that were in the chat and references and things like that. and then be open to suggestions how to improve it.
Exactly. If you have any suggestions, please let us know. We just started this out, bless you. We just started this out, and so that's why I guess it hasn't been sort of announced for the next speakers. We're just sort of in the process of finalizing that, and we will announce it. If you have any suggestions, let us know. Many thanks to Kanaka and Brad, without whom we wouldn't have been able to manage the wonderful chat that is going on. And yeah, I guess see you guys next week, hopefully.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
All right.